Welcome to the Vanderbilt Philosophy Department Faculty Interviews. I'm here with Professor Matthew Congdon.
Hello.
Matthew, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm happy to do this.
So Matthew is a philosophy graduate from the New School for Social Research and Skidmore's philosophy department from a little ways back. And Matthew's areas of focus are moral philosophy, working on a book on conceptual moral change, and philosophical psychology. So we'll start, before we jump into the research, Matthew, what got you into philosophy?
I was 12 years old.
All right. This is the Wayback Machine here.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
really, I was. So I was at a summer camp and sitting out under the stars one night with some friends, fellow 12-year-olds, and we were looking at the stars and could see comets. It was really beautiful. You could see the Milky Way. And we got into a conversation about the very idea that space is infinite. And that then led into a conversation about time being infinite. And that led into a more general discussion about like the very idea of infinity. And we didn't come to any profound conclusions that evening as like a group of 12-year-olds. But it was, I remember something like, there was like a genuine moment where like a kind of click or something where for the first time, I realized there are questions that are deeply worth asking, deeply important, that I was compelled and like magnetized by, but didn't have obvious like fact-like answers. So, like, you go through, as a 12-year-old, like school is, you ask questions that have fact answers. You know, you like, what's the capital of Indonesia and what's like 7 times 8 and, you know, who sealed the Magna Carta, and you learn the facts. And those are like, that's what truth is these facts, which are answers to questions. But it felt like there was something really deeply worth answering. And I kind of liked the fact that it seemed like we could go on and on and on, have that conversation infinitely. And we wouldn't like reach something, we're like, oh, okay, that's it, we got it, now we can move on to the next thing. But it didn't mean that it wasn't a question worth asking, just because we couldn't have some like clear answer that was done. I loved it, and I didn't know what we were doing was philosophy. I didn't have a name for it then, but I got hooked from there.
You were hooked. So maybe a follow-up question to this then. So there's a long time between 12 years old and sitting at a summer camp and looking at the stars, and then showing up in college and there being classes with the big P word in front of them. So what happened in those intervening years?
I went to a really great public high school where, obviously, many people know, not all public schools teach philosophy. But we just happened to have a program where I was introduced, I think it was so we read Kierkegaard, we read Descartes, and we read Sartre. And that I got introduced to the P word. I realized, okay, this is a thing.
Oh, that's
people
that's
do
what we were
this.
doing.
Yeah, people actually, like, there's a whole tradition. Actually, and it goes back thousands of years where people, like, precisely ask these questions. And, like, there's a discipline and a tradition and texts and people who are excited about talking about it. And so I actually I think my junior year in high school is when I started to actually read philosophical texts. And then it just from there kind of snowballed, because as soon as I went to Skidmore, I started like looking into the course catalog for philosophy classes. I took Intro to Philosophy my first semester, and I think I declared my philosophy major on the first day you were allowed to declare a major as a sophomore.
They're banging on the door.
Yeah, so from there, and I had some really wonderful professors at Skidmore who taught great classes and kind of continued to make me feel like this was where I wanted my mind to go. Yeah, so yeah.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And so ended up at the New School afterwards.
Yep.
And tell us about the kind of the intellectual environment that you found whenever you came to that unique intellectual environment.
It is a unique place. I sort of as I learned more about the different areas of philosophy as an undergrad. I was still interested in the big questions like what is infinity, but I got more and more into ethics and social and political questions, and I started to do some research on places that had this as a strength. And the New School is a program that's it's distinct in a couple of ways. One, there is a pretty strong commitment to a kind of pluralist approach where the history of philosophy is really important, and the sort of so-called analytic continental distinction is not so important to them, which actually was really attractive to me. that, not that they sort of denied it altogether, they didn't come up, but it was just, we just picked from texts that we found illuminating, and I really like that kind of ecumenical approach. And the New School for Social Research, as the name indicates, that philosophy was placed within a constellation of other social sciences along a kind of German model. So alongside sociology and politics and economics, and the thought being that philosophy was one part of this broader effort to understand the social. And that's why it's called the New School for Social Research, which is different from, say, my undergrad, where philosophy was actually, the department was called the Department of Philosophy and Religion. So a lot of places, like small liberal arts colleges like Skidmore, it's interesting to see where different universities stick philosophy. That's kind of like religion. That's kind of like theology. They're both thinking about infinity.
Put it with psychology, or they put it right. Yeah, okay. So this
and I liked that the New School paired it with, like, all of these disciplines were together part of one effort to think about what it means to be a social creature, what it means to be a human being living in a society, to criticize society when it has injustices and things like that. That to me was a really attractive conception of what philosophy is and where philosophy fits as deeply relevant and important within the broader academia.
And your research is actually a continuation of those kinds of questions. The new book, I've got to look at it really quickly. Moral articulation on the formation of new moral concepts.
Yes.
So this is an extension of being able to find injustice, calling out injustice, even articulating new ways for us to find injustices. So, or I guess that's one of the questions, is there a finding, or is it a new kind of conception? So what exactly is it to have a new moral concept?
Yeah, so it is that balance between, is it a finding versus is it a creating, what I'm most interested in the book. So yeah, in the book, I'm thinking about I have a bunch of concrete case studies in the book. So I mostly focus on, so when I think about what's an example of a new moral concept or a new moral category, I'm thinking about mainly new categories and phrases, new forms of language that refer to forms of wrongdoing that didn't exist prior to the 20th century. So some examples, like the word genocide did not exist before the 1940s. The word sexism, as far as I've been able to find, like the earliest coining I think is 1964. The phrase sexual harassment was developed in 1975. Hate speech, not until the 80s, it's actually used as a phrase. So these are examples, and I think those are all really interesting examples to work with, because in a way, like our contemporary moral vocabulary, if you want to use that phrase, would be kind of unthinkable without being able to use those words. But just a century ago or so, we didn't have them. Nobody would have heard of them. Yeah. And I'm really interested in the question which you put in terms of, is it finding or creating? That there's a philosophical question you could raise, and that many people have raised. So when we bring morally significant events and descriptions under morally significant events and experiences under new descriptions, are we, on the one hand, naming moral realities that already existed, like fully intact, and were already had the moral importance that they did prior to having any kind of linguistic expression? Or, on the other hand, is it the case that, as many people have argued, moral reality or moral phenomena are kind of sensitive to the way to the words we use to describe it, such that to name some experience, say, of being violated, actually has deeply transformative effects. And you can see how people go in both directions. On the one hand, to give a very broad name to it, people who call themselves moral realists might tend more towards, like, no, these realities are there.
Discovering them. Yes.
They're always wrong, and all we're doing is the kind of helpful, it's still important, but the kind of helpful task of making explicit in language moral facts that already existed. And then really far on the other extreme, you have someone who might want to say, like, no, discourse is, like, constitutive of reality. It actually shapes what is real and what we value, and there is no valuing prior to human beings coming into the world and speaking about morals. And so they could have a really far on the other extreme view where, like, no, you're actually creating value through the modes of discourse we create about it. And the big upshot of my book, or the idea I'm trying to defend, is that you can have both.
Amazing!
Yeah. or a version of each, a mitigated
version of each, right?
Yeah.
So I guess So these mixed views, a puzzle with mixed views is whether or not you get the virtues of the two things together, whether or not you get the vices of the two things.
Virtues.
Hopefully the virtues. So maybe some questions about this, because on the one hand it looked like it was a sort of a puzzle with language, and on the other hand it looked like it was a puzzle with experience. And maybe one of the we might call it a kind of a phenomenology at the very least for our purposes maybe here, and maybe you can help me out. But one of the things that you're looking at are these sort of uncanny moments, or these sort of discursive breakdowny moments where it looks like your moral vocabulary is failing you with a certain kind of either violation or thing that you say, look, this went wrong, but I don't have a name for it.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about that phenomenon and how this bears on this other kind of realism, anti-realism question?
Right. So, in response to the first thing you said, is it a question? How did you put it? There's a question about language, or is it a question
about experience?
Or about experience?
Yeah.
Well, the way they go together is, at least not universally, but there's one widespread view is that our experience is mediated by the language we have. So the from early childhood, as you learn a language, you're not just learning like a set of words that are instrumental for communicating, but you're kind of inheriting past generations' conceptions of the layout of reality and the layout of like how things are intelligible. You're inheriting kind of a whole tradition. This is kind of a Gadamerrian thought, that as you learn a language, you're inheriting a tradition, and you're inheriting kind of an orientation in the space of reasons, if you want to put it that way. So in that sense, there's many different versions of this idea, but I also do hold to some version of the idea that the linguistic or discursive or expressive means that we have habituated ourselves to adopt actually does have an impact on our experience. It actually shapes like what kind of objects we perceive. It helps that I have the concept of a table, that this is an individuated thing and not just like an extension of the floor or something like that. So to cut a very long and complicated story short. But, and then here's like the big but, and that leads to the sort of discursive breakdown is one of the concepts I talk about a lot in the first chapter of the book. On the other hand, even though it does seem to be the case that our experience of the world and of morals in particular is very much shaped by the languages that we have to describe it, nevertheless, it's also a pretty common experience to be confronted with something that seems really meaningful and important, and you desperately want to be able to talk about. Your words are just like it's like marbles in your mouth. You can't find the right discursive means to give expression to like some really valuable aspect of a friendship that you're in, or take it out of the moral case, like the experience of beauty in the face of a painting, or take a moral case. So here now we finally get back to the kinds of examples I was mentioning earlier. The experience of sexual harassment prior to 1975, prior to the development of a kind of clear, precise, neat label and accompanying discursive framework for voicing grievances about that, both legally and morally. There's still something there. So it's not like, we don't have the concept, like if someone doesn't have the language of sexual harassment, they simply see nothing or feel
couldn't
nothing.
Experience that, or couldn't experience some violation.
Exactly.
There.
Yeah.
So that's the both and element, which is there is a sense that you can have the experience. It's an uncanny experience that's hard to articulate. Once you get the vocabulary, that experience has got sort of sharper bounds and has got a kind of a nameableness to it, and that gives it its own unique standing forth. Then. So this phenomenon, sometimes called the looping phenomenon, you've got another kind of question: are moral facts loopy? And so, explain a little bit about what it is for a fact to be loopy, and then we'll get back to the question: are moral facts like that?
Sure. Yeah. So this is the title of a paper that I've just written is called "Are Moral Facts Loopy?" And so, to get into it, what does it mean? So the loopiness comes from this metaphor that some philosophers like Ian Hacking and Sally Haslinger use called a feedback loop. And what they're interested in is something very similar to what we've been talking about. It seems as though there's a kind of feedback loop or reciprocal relationship between the concepts that we bring to bear on certain social phenomena and then the material structure of those social phenomena themselves. So I'll give you an example that's not about moral facts to start. An example would be, well, we talk about gender in certain ways, and so we talk about there being two genders, and we said there are men and there are women. That's a kind of conceptual. You might say that, like, you might think initially, well, that's in my head, like in people's heads. That's like a conceptual framework that people have in people's heads, or is like in the kind of language they use. But then when people use a kind of binary language, that's going to affect material stuff in the actual social world, like the way toilet facilities are designed. And then you have a men's room and a women's room. But then people who speak that way use those facilities. They live in the social world, and their habits of language use and concept use and what categories make sense to them are trained by the way the social world is structured. And so then it becomes natural that, of course, we have these two categories. So it loops back up and reinforces the initial conceptual scheme. And then when you have shifts like we've seen, recently, the past few decades of challenging a binary notion of gender, we can see how the loop gets affected. You start getting used to, like, there are gender neutral bathrooms, and this can like have an actual very important effect on the reconceptualizing the way we think about these kinds of social phenomena. So that's a looping effect. The very idea that the concepts we use to talk about social reality and the material structure of social reality itself mutually either reinforce one another, or as one shifts, the other shifts as well.
I see.
Yeah.
So, how the concept works affect how we, especially as folks aware of the concept, behave in light of it, which then either reinforces the concept or, in some cases, disrupts that concept, or makes it so that it looks like there are cases where we need to rethink the concept. So that's with, you might say, a sort of a case with moral import, but not necessarily a moral case, which is the gender is not a moral concept, but our applications of it can be moral. So let's now think about moral concepts. What kinds of examples have we got of moral concepts that might be loopy in this way?
Yeah, so there's some cases that are more obvious than others. Okay. I think the easy cases, which I don't think raise as many philosophical questions, are what you might call, like Bernard Williams called, like, thick moral concepts that are still descriptive of very concrete things in the world, yet also have a moral valence. And you could see, like, so I'll give you one example, like cyberbullying is arguably a moral concept because it denotes a form of wrongdoing, but it doesn't make any, like, Aristotle didn't include cyberbullying in his, like, Nicomachean Ethics 2,500 years ago, and we don't blame him for that. We didn't think he missed something. So there's easy cases where you think about, okay, moral language and social reality are shifting together, and we actually do need to kind of catch up. Like, a way to put it is we as social organization changes and technology changes, we invent new ways to hurt each other and violate each other and harm each other, and then moral language has to catch up to that and find names for that so that grievances are possible and redress is possible, and we can better articulate bad things that are happening in the world. I'm focusing on bad things. You could also, the same goes for good stuff. That
was going to be the follow-up, which is that we've got a development of moral vocabulary that's a longer list of bads.
Yeah.
Could there be a longer list of goods?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I mean, if so I've been focusing on cases of moral wrongdoing, but you could have, like, new kinds of experiences of shared joy that call out for articulation. New ways to describe, like, solidarity in a political movement. If those do in fact call for new vocabularies, then that would be an instance of this kind of moral concept development that I'm thinking about. And then I also think even more fundamental concepts. So, like I said, cyberbullying is an example that's kind of easier because of course it didn't exist for Aristotle, and of course moral language and a new kind of value, like the disvalue, let's say, of that form of violation is new in a sense. But I even want to argue, this is where I get a little more contentious in my book and in this article, Are Moral Facts Loopy, that really much more fundamental moral concepts. One case I try to make, I won't attempt to make it here, but the one case I try to make is the concept of personhood. But lots of people have already argued from a historical point of view, that it's historical, that it develops mostly in the modern period, and that there's this distinction between, like, honor societies and then a notion of egalitarian respect that emerges at some point in modernity. So the idea that the word and, like, actual human practices surrounding, like, equal respect for persons, and that being historical is not so controversial. But the idea that the value of personhood itself is not ahistorical, but is emerging over time through a certain kind of looping effect, that's a little more controversial. But what I want to say is that a concept like personhood, I don't want to say that it's loopy in, like, a really historically contingent sense.
Yeah, like a full bootstraps sense.
That would be bad, because then whatever the downside there obviously is that whatever forces happen to have like
we change the way we talk, and now the values go away.
Whatever forces are in power can change the way we talk, and then certain people would cease to become persons, and it would be true if you went with that sort of strong form of looping. I try to talk about it in terms of a notion of maturation. So maturation, like the idea of, and this is why a lot of my work had to do with the concept of moral progress, and I like thinking about it in terms of a kind of maturation process, in which is, if you think about the concept of maturation, we use it in a way, like think about, let's use an analogy, when you speak about an artist's like career maturing over time, you can say that an artist has matured over time and appreciate that without positing that there was like one true telos that he was maturing towards that entire time, that was like set in stone forever. Nevertheless, it's still an evaluation you can make. There's a kind of maturation here. It's like there's something new and interesting, without saying like there's just one
there's
preset.
The masterwork
there's one preset, like
endpoint
in that case it would be like you'd be an aesthetic realist in an ahistorical sense. There's like the aesthetic truth that he's finally gotten to. And I want to say there's something analogous in the moral case, that we as human beings have to be creative in the way we articulate what is valuable and what's important about a human life. And personhood is one of the really interesting, fundamental, creative ways we've tried to articulate the meaningfulness and importance of a human life. But that it hasn't just remained static. Like it's not the same concept or value that it was, say, for hunter-gatherers 40,000 years ago, or a medieval peasant, or us today, that it's had to undergo a kind of maturation process. And so the concept of maturation for me is the way I'm trying to keep that historicity, but not fall into that deep kind of contingency that leads to the problem where, well, whoever happens to be in power can change the way we talk, and then if we change the way we talk, then we can make terrible, unjust things just seem just because you're able to make it so.
That is one of the worries about, you might say, this sort of the anti-realist trend. So, and one of the interesting things about the way that you worked on this notion of maturation is on the analogy with works of art. And so showing your breadth here in terms of pulling in concepts from beyond the moral realm to help bring some light, namely from aesthetics. And so this notion of the maturation of an artist coming from aesthetics. And this is another one of the places where you're doing a lot of research and a lot of teaching. Let's talk a little bit about some of the classes. So you taught an aesthetics class here at Vanderbilt. So tell us about that, and we'll then kind of move to some of the classes that are on the books now, and then maybe
I'm
some
teaching
in the
it next
future.
semester.
Okay, got it. Good.
I've taught
history of aesthetics.
History of aesthetics.
It's
in the spring. I've taught it like many times. It's one of my. It might be my favorite. I don't know. It's one of my favorite classes to teach at the undergraduate level. It is the history of aesthetics. So we read the passages in Plato's Republic. We talk about the banning of the poets. We read Aristotle and tragedy. We read some tragedies, and we sort of go from there. But I also really like, so the one thing I really like about that class is this is the class I think where I make the best use of sort of Nashville as a broader classroom, so to speak.
Fantastic.
So we have the Frist Museum of Art.
Great resource,
and there the chief curator, Mark Scala, has been wonderful. He has worked with me in the past, and we're going to work again together this semester too. So Mark Scala always is one big exhibition that he's curated, and it's usually around some theme. Like a few years ago, it was about like ghostly bodies. There was one year where it fit really nicely with the class because it was on the sublime in painting. And the sublime is this really important concept that gets talked about in like German Romanticism and Kant. Kant's aesthetics is a crucial category for Kant as an aesthetic category. It ties into some things in Nietzsche's aesthetics. And so that semester, at least, Mark and I actually spent some time pre-semester and crafted a couple weeks of the class to like tailor the readings to the paintings.
Amazing.
And then Mark, the chief curator of the Frist, gave us a tour of the exhibition and talked to the students and came to our class and gave a lecture on it and a discussion, and it was one of the best events we've had. But I've had other artists, other art critics visit the class and sort of talk about that. We went to the Belcourt movie theater, local, wonderful independent movie theater here in Nashville, and saw I think it was the 30th anniversary of Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Am I getting my dates, my decades right? I think it was the 30th. And just nice events like that where we actually get to just study the philosophy of art and beauty, but actually going out and seeing it. Nashville is a good place to do that.
So that course is going to be on the books for the spring of 22, and you're also teaching a seminar on Wittgenstein language and skepticism for this in the spring. Tell us a little bit about that one.
Okay, yeah. Wittgenstein, one of the most important 20th century philosophers, philosopher of language. My personal interest in it comes a lot from what we were talking about earlier. I obviously, because of my project thinking about the way moral concepts are developed, I'm really interested in philosophers who have a lot to say about language. So that's one of the primary reasons I wanted to teach it. But we're going to focus primarily on his later philosophy. We're going to focus on a book called The Philosophical Investigations, where he introduces a bunch of concepts that get used a lot and thrown around by contemporary philosophers, like a language game or a form of life, or so there's these this famous example he has at the end of the book about like experiencing another person's pain. But I think it's always nice. Like, these get quoted so often, and the concepts, like everybody sort of throws around the concept of a language game, and we all assume we know what it means. But I always like going back to texts like this and realizing that none of us really know what he's talking about, and trying to go back and be like, what did Wittgenstein actually mean by this?
Really mean by
Don't ask, then don't follow up by asking me what he meant by that, because I don't know yet.
What is a Sprachspiel?
Yeah.
Was ist ein Sprachspiel?
Yeah.
So Wittgenstein skepticism. So far Wittgenstein in the language, but so how's the skepticism fit in there?
Well, so I also, as part of this class, I'm going to be teaching large portions of a book by a philosopher named Stanley Cavell called The Claim of Reason. And Cavell, one of his many great contributions to philosophy is to really, you could probably talk more about this than me in a way, but I think give one of the most creative reconfigurations of what was traditionally known as the problem of skepticism about other minds, which is, something you can give there's a textbook version of it where like, I can't know what's inside your head. I don't even know if there is anything inside your head.
Aren't you just a sort of a fancy pinball machine over there?
Yeah, like what proof, what evidence do I have that you're not just an extremely sophisticated automaton? Yeah. And taking inspiration from Wittgenstein, Cavell was able to give this whole new approach to the problem where he tries to describe the separateness that between human beings that philosophers in the 20th century tried to articulate in terms of skepticism. He thinks that's better captured in terms of tragedy. So he thinks that skepticism actually it's a truth to it, but it falls short of capturing what's truly deep about the fact that I can actually doubt whether, say, you're in deep physical pain or whether there's some deep emotions that you're hiding from me. But the reason why it's in this class is Cavell's main point of sort of inspiration were the passages on pain in the investigations, where Wittgenstein raises that question about skepticism concerning another person being in severe pain and my missing it or not knowing it, or perhaps not even being able to know that. And I find this really fascinating, and I'm excited to discuss it with students.
And using tragedy as a means of articulating that is another case where aesthetic concepts from aesthetics are used as clarifying tools for these problems. And so this is another nice place where, again, the sort of the breadth of all these issues are siloing them is an error for us, seeing them as mutually relevant and in some ways using them to exfoliate each other. So this seems to be a sort of a persistent theme in your work, Matt.
I don't think ethics and aesthetics are so far apart.
So we've got next semester's courses. Let's talk about this semester's courses. So this is just here at the end of fall of 2021. You're teaching a general logic course, and you're teaching the honors seminar on the struggle for recognition and social progress. Tell us about those two classes.
Yeah, sure. So general logic is a class that I think I've taught more than any other here.
That's the two of us, friend.
Yeah. The logic professors here. It's a real kind of fundamental introduction to like the very idea that there are norms of thought, that that there is actually something to be said in favor of the idea that arguments can be evaluated as better and worse than each other, that we're not all just spewing hot air and
don't say that argument's bad because I don't like the conclusion.
And it's a sort of combination of a series of formal methods for representing arguments in symbolic terms, followed by some an exploration of informal logic, thinking about definitions and fallacies, and then finally at the end we get into some just to dip our toes into philosophy of logic, reading some Graham Priest and thinking about the possibility there might be true contradictions.
True contradictions. That sounds false or true.
Yeah.
Or ain't true.
Or both.
So so tell us about the honors seminar and the struggle for recognition program.
Yeah. So this is really cool. It's part of this college honors seminars that are kind of smaller classes devoted to kind of intensive introduction to some topic. There's still 1,000 level classes, so it is kind of introductory, and none of the students in the class are philosophy majors, but at the same time they're really ready to just dive into something, so there's a lot of enthusiasm. And yeah, I decided, I was trying to think about what would be the right kind of topic that could be both, sort of meet both of those sides, on the one hand, not presupposing any prior history of no knowledge of the history of philosophy or other philosophy courses, but also be something that we really could do a deep dive into and get not just feel like we're doing a superficial survey. And there's been this literature that's developed. In our class, we're only going from 1992 forward, but on the concept of recognition, which very roughly refers something to acts, interpersonal acts whereby I extend some kind of validation of your own sense of your self-worth. So Axel Honneth, German philosopher, talks about there being 3 fundamental forms of recognition: love, respect, and esteem. And the big thesis is that of any recognition theory, there are lots of different recognition theories, but the common thread for all of them is I shouldn't say this to you because it's just kind of like an anti-Stoic thesis, but it's something like
okay, I'm familiar with them.
but it's a good way to think about it. It's like the polar opposite of Stoicism in some respects, because the idea is I cannot have a healthy, positive relation to self that would allow me to flourish as a human being without the receipt of certain fundamental forms of recognition from others. So the ways that others regard me and then confirm through expressive acts of validation that I am valued, that I am loved, that I make contributions to shared social life that are valuable, and that also that I am respected as an equal in some sense. Without those, one cannot have a healthy, flourishing life. I'm really interested in that thesis. I don't know what the proof of it could be, or I'm still trying to figure out exactly how that works.
That's a really appealing thesis, and it's one that clearly lays responsibilities on us to acknowledge each other. Mm-hmm. So you might say, if this is something that's sort of fundamental to your ethical being, and to your being qua being you, that's something that it looks like I would owe to you, given our shared overlaps. But you're right. It is a fundamentally anti-Stoic view. The Stoics would say, you got to be able to go on without that. But there is a sense that the Stoics would nevertheless think that you nevertheless owe that duty to others. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting. So you could be able to do it. There is a sort of a strange paradox to it. Well, this is so not to dive too deep on the Stoics on it, but the critical edge of that thesis is well heard over here. So tell us a little bit about about some classes that are kind of in the works that might be coming around the bend for us.
Yeah, sure. So things that I think I might be teaching in the future, I would really like to teach a class on, I think it would be called moral emotions, or something on the philosophy of emotion and with a kind of ethics bent to it. There's been just so much great work, both in the history of philosophy I mean, like, emotions are central in Aristotle's ethics. For example, the Stoics have very, very complex conceptions of emotion, even though they go in a very different direction from Aristotle. And then, like, the just skipping ahead a few centuries, like the early modern sentimentalist tradition, like Adam Smith has a whole book on the sentiments. Everyone thinks of him as the economist, but he had like a really important book on moral emotions, on resentment. And I'm really interested in thinking more deeply about the relation of emotional life to ethical life. But there's also been lots of really great stuff in contemporary philosophy. I think it's for me, it's one of the coolest growing areas in contemporary, say, moral psychology. And one of the reasons is that it is one of the most productive areas where philosophers and psychologists are actually getting along and actually contributing in a really healthy, good way to each other's projects, because there's actually a bit of consensus about some like basic ways of theorizing emotions in the two camps, and there's been some really productive dialogue. So I'd be also interested in exploring some of the more philosophical claims made by psychologists about emotions and vice versa. So yeah, that's one big thing that I really hope to do soon.
So again, another case of you seeing a lot of these other what sometimes might be seen as siloed programs being mutually relevant, bringing a lot of things to the table. Matt, Dr. Congdon, thanks for your time with me. Thanks for your time with us. Thanks for watching. Thanks very much, Matt.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was great.